Chapter 12. Round the Table. A joint inquest was held on Monday. I do not propose to give the proceedings in detail. To do so would only be to go over the same ground again and again. By arrangement with the police, very little was allowed to come out. I gave evidence as to the cause of Ackroyd's death and the probable time. The absence of Ralph Paton was commented on by the coroner, but not unduly stressed. Afterwards, Poirot and I had a few words with Inspector Raglan. The inspector was very grave. "It looks bad, Mr. Poirot," he said. "I'm trying to judge the thing fair and square. I'm a local man, and I've seen Captain Paton many times in Cranchester. I'm not wanting him to be the guilty one, but it's bad whichever way you look at it. If he's innocent, why doesn't he come forward? We've got evidence against him, but it's just possible that that evidence could be explained away. Then why doesn't he give an explanation?" A lot more lay behind the inspector's words than I knew at the time. Ralph's description had been wired to every port and railway station in England. The police everywhere were on the alert. His rooms in town were watched, and any houses he had been known to be in the habit of frequenting. With such a cordon, it seemed impossible that Ralph should be able to evade detection. He had no luggage and, as far as anyone knew, no money. "I can't find anyone who saw him at the station that night," continued the inspector. "And yet he's well known down here, and you'd think somebody would have noticed him. There's no news from Liverpool either." "You think he went to Liverpool?" queried Poirot. "Well, it's on the cards. That telephone message from the station, just 3 minutes before the Liverpool express left, there ought to be something in that. Unless it was deliberately intended to throw you off the scent. That might just possibly be the point of the telephone message." "That's an idea," said the inspector eagerly. "Do you really think that's the explanation of the telephone call?" "My friend," said Poirot gravely, "I do not know. But I will tell you this. I believe that when we find the explanation of that telephone call, we shall find the explanation of the murder." "You said something like that before, I remember," I observed, looking at him curiously. Poirot nodded. "I always come back to it," he said seriously. "It seems to me utterly irrelevant," I declared. "I wouldn't say that," demurred the inspector. "But I must confess I think Mr. Poirot here harps on it a little too much. We've better clues than that. The fingerprints on the dagger, for instance." Poirot became suddenly very foreign in manner, as he often did when excited over anything. "Emlyn Spector," he said, "beware of the blind, comment Dyer, the little street that has no end to it." Inspector Raglan stared, but I was quicker. "You mean a blind alley?" I said. "That is it, the blind street that leads nowhere. So it may be with those fingerprints, they may lead you nowhere." "I don't see how that can well be," said the police officer. "I suppose you're hinting that they're faked?" "I've read of such things being done, though I can't say I've ever come across it in my experience. But fake or true, they're bound to lead somewhere." Poirot merely shrugged his shoulders, flinging out his arms wide. The inspector then showed us various enlarged photographs of the fingerprints, and proceeded to become technical on the subject of loops and whorls. "Come now," he said at last, annoyed by Poirot's detached manner, "you've got to admit that those prints were made by someone who was in the house that night?" "Bien entendu," said Poirot, nodding his head. "Well, I've taken the prints of every member of the household, every one, mind you, from the old lady down to the kitchen maid. I don't think Mrs. Ackroyd would enjoy being referred to as the old lady. She must spend a considerable amount on cosmetics." "Every one's," repeated the inspector fussily. "Including mine," I said dryly. "Very well. None of them correspond. That leaves us two alternatives. Ralph Paton, or the mysterious stranger the doctor here tells us about. When we get hold of those two—" "Much valuable time may have been lost," broke in Poirot. "I don't quite get you, Mr. Poirot." "You have taken the prints of everyone in the house, you say," murmured Poirot. Is that the exact truth you are telling me there, L'Inspecteur? Certainly. Without overlooking anyone? Without overlooking anyone. The quick or the dead? For a moment, the inspector looked bewildered at what he took to be a religious observation. Then he reacted slowly. You mean the dead, L'Inspecteur? The inspector still took a minute or two to understand. I am suggesting, said Poirot placidly, that the fingerprints on the dagger handle are those of Mr. Ackroyd himself. It is an easy matter to verify. His body is still available. But why? What would be the point of it? You're surely not suggesting suicide, Mr. Poirot? Ah, no. My theory is that the murderer wore gloves or wrapped something round his hand. After the blow was struck, he picked up the victim's hand and closed it round the dagger handle. But why? Poirot shrugged his shoulders again. To make a confusing case even more confusing. Well, said the inspector, I'll look into it. What gave you the idea in the first place? When you were so kind as to show me the dagger and draw attention to the fingerprints. I know very little of loops and whorls, see, I confess my ignorance frankly. But it did occur to me that the position of the prints was somewhat awkward. Not so would I have held a dagger in order to strike. Naturally, with the right hand brought up over the shoulder backwards, it would have been difficult to put it in exactly the right position. Inspector Raglan stared at the little man. Poirot, with an air of great unconcern, flecked a speck of dust from his coat sleeve. Well, said the inspector, it's an idea. I'll look into it all right, but don't you be disappointed if nothing comes of it. He endeavored to make his tone kindly and patronizing. Poirot watched him go off. Then he turned to me with twinkling eyes. Another time, he observed, I must be more careful of his amour propre. And now that we are left to our own devices, what do you think, my good friend, of a little reunion of the family? The little reunion, as Poirot called it, took place about half an hour later. We sat round the table in the dining room at Fernley, Poirot at the head of the table, like the chairman of some ghastly board meeting. The servants were not present, so we were 6 in all. Mrs. Ackroyd, Flora, Major Blunt, young Raymond, Poirot, and myself. When everyone was assembled, Poirot rose and bowed. Messieurs, Mesdames, I have called you together for a certain purpose. He paused. To begin with, I want to make a very special plea to Mademoiselle. To me, said Flora. Mademoiselle, you are engaged to Captain Ralph Patten. If anyone is in his confidence, you are. I beg you most earnestly, if you know of his whereabouts, to persuade him to come forward. One little minute, as Flora raised her head to speak, say nothing till you have well reflected. Mademoiselle, his position grows daily more dangerous. If he had come forward at once, no matter how damning the facts, he might have had a chance of explaining them away. But this silence, this flight, what can it mean? Surely only one thing, knowledge of guilt. Mademoiselle, if you really believe in his innocence, persuade him to come forward before it is too late. Flora's face had gone very white. Too late, she repeated very low. Poirot leant forward, looking at her. See now, mademoiselle, he said very gently, it is Papa Poirot who asks you this. The old Papa Poirot, who has much knowledge and much experience. I would not seek to entrap you, mademoiselle. Will you not trust me, and tell me where Ralph Patten is hiding? The girl rose and stood facing him. M. Poirot, she said in a clear voice, I swear to you, swear solemnly, that I have no idea where Ralph is, and that I have neither seen him nor heard from him either on the day of the murder or since. She sat down again. Poirot gazed at her in silence for a minute or two, then he brought his hand down on the table with a sharp rap. Bien. That is that, he said. His face hardened. Now I appeal to these others who sit round this table, Mrs. Ackroyd, Major Blunt, Dr. Shepherd, Mr. Raymond. You are all friends and intimates of the missing man. If you know where Ralph Patten is hiding, speak out. There was a long silence. Poirot looked to each in turn. I beg of you, he said in a low voice, speak out. But still there was silence, broken at last by Mrs. Ackroyd. I must say, she observed in a plaintive voice, that Ralph's absence is most peculiar indeed. Not to come forward at such a time. It looks, you know, as though there were something behind it. I can't help thinking, Flora dear, that it was a very fortunate thing your engagement was never formally announced. Mother, cried Flora angrily. Providence, declared Mrs. Ackroyd. I have a devout belief in Providence, a divinity that shapes our ends, as Shakespeare's beautiful line runs. Surely you don't make the Almighty directly responsible for thick ankles, Mrs. Ackroyd, do you? Asked Geoffrey Raymond, his irresponsible laugh ringing out. His idea was, I think, to loosen the tension, but Mrs. Ackroyd threw him a glance of reproach and took out her handkerchief. Flora has been saved a terrible amount of notoriety and unpleasantness. Not for a moment that I think dear Ralph had anything to do with poor Roger's death. I don't think so. But then I have a trusting heart, I always have had ever since a child. I am loath to believe the worst of anyone. But of course, one must remember that Ralph was in several air raids as a young boy. The results are apparent long after, sometimes they say. People are not responsible for their actions in the least. They lose control, you know, without being able to help it. Mother, cried Flora, you don't think Ralph did it? Come, Mrs. Ackroyd, said Blunt. I don't know what to think, said Mrs. Ackroyd tearfully. It's all very upsetting. What would happen to the estate, I wonder, if Ralph were found guilty? Raymond pushed his chair away from the table violently. Major Blunt remained very quiet, looking thoughtfully at her. Like shell shock, you know, said Mrs. Ackroyd obstinately, and I dare say Roger kept him very short of money, with the best intentions, of course. I can see you are all against me, but I do think it is very odd that Ralph has not come forward, and I must say I am thankful Flora's engagement was never announced formally. It will be tomorrow, said Flora in a clear voice. Flora, cried her mother aghast. Flora had turned to the secretary. Will you send the announcement to the Morning Post and the Times, please, Mr. Raymond? If you are sure that it is wise, Miss Ackroyd, he replied gravely. She turned impulsively to Blunt. You understand, she said. What else can I do? As things are, I must stand by Ralph. Don't you see that I must? She looked very searchingly at him, and after a long pause he nodded abruptly. Mrs. Ackroyd burst out into shrill protests. Flora remained unmoved. Then Raymond spoke. I appreciate your motives, Miss Ackroyd. But don't you think you're being rather precipitate? Wait a day or two. Tomorrow, said Flora in a clear voice. It's no good, Mother, going on like this. Whatever else I am, I'm not disloyal to my friends. M. Poirot, Mrs. Ackroyd appealed tearfully, can't you say anything at all? Nothing to be said, interpolated Blunt. She's doing the right thing. I'll stand by her through thick and thin. Flora held out her hand to him. Thank you, Major Blunt, she said. Mademoiselle, said Poirot, will you let an old man congratulate you on your courage and your loyalty? And will you not misunderstand me if I ask you most solemnly, to postpone the announcement you speak of for at least 2 days more? Flora hesitated. I ask it in Ralph Patton's interests as much as in yours, mademoiselle. You frown. You do not see how that can be. But I assure you that it is so. Pas de blagues. You put the case into my hands, you must not hamper me now. Flora paused a few minutes before replying. I do not like it, she said at last, but I will do what you say. She sat down again at the table. And now, messieurs et mesdames, said Poirot rapidly, I will continue with what I was about to say. Understand this, I mean to arrive at the truth. The truth, however ugly in itself, is always curious and beautiful to the seeker after it. I am much aged, my powers may not be what they were. Here he clearly expected a contradiction. In all probability, this is the last case I shall ever investigate. But Hercule Poirot does not end with a failure. Messieurs et mesdames, I tell you, I mean to know. And I shall know, in spite of you all. He brought out the last words provocatively, hurling them in our face as it were. I think we all flinched back a little, excepting Geoffrey Raymond, who remained good-humored and imperturbable as usual. How do you mean, in spite of us all? He asked with slightly raised eyebrows. But just that, monsieur. Every one of you in this room is concealing something from me. He raised his hand as a faint murmur of protest arose. Yes, yes, I know what I am saying. It may be something unimportant, trivial, which is supposed to have no bearing on the case, but there it is. Each one of you has something to hide. Come now, am I right? His glance, challenging and accusing, swept round the table. And every pair of eyes dropped before his. Yes, mine as well. I am answered, said Poirot with a curious laugh. He got up from his seat. I appeal to you all. Tell me the truth, the whole truth. There was a silence. Will no one speak? He gave the same short laugh again. C'est dommage, he said, and went out. Chapter 13. The Goose Quill. That evening, at Poirot's request, I went over to his house after dinner. Caroline saw me depart with visible reluctance. I think she would have liked to have accompanied me. Poirot greeted me hospitably. He had placed a bottle of Irish whiskey, which I detest, on a small table with a soda-water siphon and a glass. He himself was engaged in brewing hot chocolate. It was a favorite beverage of his, I discovered later. He inquired politely after my sister, whom he declared to be a most interesting woman. I'm afraid you've been giving her a swelled head, I said dryly. What about Sunday afternoon? He laughed and twinkled. I always like to employ the expert, he remarked obscurely, but he refused to explain the remark. You got all the local gossip anyway, I remarked. True and untrue. And a great deal of valuable information, he added quietly. Such as? He shook his head. Why not have told me the truth, he countered. In a place like this, all Ralph Patton's doings were bound to be known. If your sister had not happened to pass through the wood that day, somebody else would have done so. I suppose they would, I said grumpily. What about this interest of yours in my patients? Again he twinkled. Only one of them, doctor. Only one of them. The last? I hazarded. I find Miss Russell a study of the most interesting, he said evasively. Do you agree with my sister and Mrs. Ackroyd that there is something fishy about her? I asked. Eh? What do you say, fishy? I explained, to the best of my ability. And they say that, do they? Didn't my sister convey as much to you yesterday afternoon? C'est possible. For no reason whatever, I declared. Les femmes, generalized Poirot. They are marvelous. They invent haphazard, and by miracle they are right. Not that it is that, really. Women observe subconsciously 1,000 little details, without knowing that they are doing so. Their subconscious mind adds these little things together, and they call the result intuition. Me, I am very skilled in psychology. I know these things. He swelled his chest out importantly, looking so ridiculous that I found it difficult not to burst out laughing. Then he took a small sip of his chocolate, and carefully wiped his mustache. I wish you'd tell me, I burst out, what you really think of it all. He put down his cup. You wish that? I do. You have seen what I have seen. Should not our ideas be the same? I'm afraid you're laughing at me, I said stiffly. Of course, I've no experience of matters of this kind. Poirot smiled at me indulgently. You are like the little child who wants to know the way the engine works. You wish to see the affair, not as the family doctor sees it, but with the eye of a detective who knows and cares for no one, to whom they are all strangers and all equally liable to suspicion. You put it very well, I said. So I give you then a little lecture. The first thing is to get a clear history of what happened that evening, always bearing in mind that the person who speaks may be lying. I raised my eyebrows. Rather a suspicious attitude. But necessary, I assure you necessary. Now first, Dr. Shepherd leaves the house at 10 minutes to 9. How do I know that? Because I told you so. But you might not be speaking the truth, or the watch you went by might be wrong. But Parker also says that you left the house at 10 minutes to 9. So we accept that statement and pass on. At 9 o'clock you run into a man, and here we come to what we will call the romance of the mysterious stranger, just outside the park gates. How do I know that that is so? I told you so, I began again, but Poirot interrupted me with a gesture of impatience. Ah, but it is that you are a little stupid tonight, my friend. You know that it is so, but how am I to know? Eh bien, I am able to tell you that the mysterious stranger was not a hallucination on your part, because the maid of a Miss Gannett met him a few minutes before you did, and of her too, he inquired the way to Fernley Park. We accept his presence therefore, and we can be fairly sure of two things about him, that he was a stranger to the neighborhood, and that whatever his object in going to Fernley, there was no great secrecy about it, since he twice asked the way there. Yes, I said, I see that. Now I have made it my business to find out more about this man. He had a drink at the Three Boars, I learn, and the barmaid there says that he spoke with an American accent, and mentioned having just come over from the States. Did it strike you that he had an American accent? Yes, I think he had, I said after a minute or two, during which I cast my mind back, but a very slight one. Précisément. There is also this which you will remember, I picked up in the summer house. He held out to me the little quill. I looked at it curiously. Then a memory of something I had read stirred in me. Poirot, who had been watching my face, nodded. Yes, heroin snow. Drug takers carry it like this and sniff it up the nose. Diamorphine hydrochloride, I murmured mechanically. This method of taking the drug is very common on the other side. Another proof, if we wanted one, that the man came from Canada or the States. What first attracted your attention to that summer house? I asked curiously. My friend the inspector took it for granted that anyone using that path did so, as a short cut to the house, but as soon as I saw the summer house, I realized that the same path would be taken by anyone using the summer house as a rendezvous. Now it seems fairly certain that the stranger came neither to the front nor to the back door. Then did someone from the house go out and meet him? If so, what could be a more convenient place than that little summer house? I searched it with the hope that I might find some clue inside. I found too the scrap of cambric and the quill. And the scrap of cambric? I asked curiously. What about that? Poirot raised his eyebrows. You do not use your little gray cells, he remarked dryly. The scrap of starched cambric should be obvious. Not very obvious to me. I changed the subject. Anyway, I said, this man went to the summer house to meet somebody. Who was that somebody? Exactly the question, said Poirot. You will remember that Mrs. Ackroyd and her daughter came over from Canada to live here? Is that what you meant today when you accused them of hiding the truth? Perhaps. Now another point. What did you think of the parlour-maid's story? What story? The story of her dismissal. Does it take half an hour to dismiss a servant? Was the story of those important papers a likely one? And remember, though she says she was in her bedroom from 9:30 until 10 o'clock, there is no one to confirm her statement. You bewilder me, I said. To me it grows clearer. But tell me now your own ideas and theories. I drew a piece of paper from my pocket. I just scribbled down a few suggestions, I said apologetically. But excellent, you have method. Let us hear them. I read out in a somewhat embarrassed voice. To begin with, one must look at the thing logically. Just what my poor Hastings used to say, interrupted Poirot, but alas, he never did so. Point number 1. Mr. Ackroyd was heard talking to someone at 9:30. Point number 2. At some time during the evening Ralph Patten must have come in through the window, as evidenced by the prints of his shoes. Point number 3. Mr. Ackroyd was nervous that evening and would only have admitted someone he knew. Point number 4. The person with Mr. Ackroyd at 9:30 was asking for money. We know Ralph Patten was in a scrape. These 4 points go to show that the person with Mr. Ackroyd at 9:30 was Ralph Patten. But we know that Mr. Ackroyd was alive at 9:45, therefore it was not Ralph who killed him. Ralph left the window open. Afterwards the murderer came in that way. And who was the murderer? Inquired Poirot. The American stranger. He may have been in league with Parker, and possibly in Parker we have the man who blackmailed Mrs. Ferrars. If so, Parker may have heard enough to realize the game was up, have told his accomplice so, and the latter did the crime with the dagger which Parker gave him. It is a theory that, admitted Poirot. Decidedly you have cells of a kind. But it leaves a good deal unaccounted for. Such as the telephone call, the pushed-out chair. Do you really think the latter important? I interrupted. Perhaps not, admitted my friend. It may have been pulled out by accident, and Raymond or Blunt may have shoved it into place unconsciously under the stress of emotion. Then there is the missing £40. Given by Ackroyd to Ralph, I suggested. He may have reconsidered his first refusal. That still leaves one thing unexplained. What? Why was Blunt so certain in his own mind that it was Raymond with Mr. Ackroyd at 9:30? He explained that, I said. You think so? I will not press the point. Tell me instead, what were Ralph Patten's reasons for disappearing? That's rather more difficult, I said slowly. I shall have to speak as a medical man. Ralph's nerves must have gone fut. If he suddenly found out that his uncle had been murdered within a few minutes of his leaving him, after perhaps a rather stormy interview, well, he might get the wind-up and clear right out. Men have been known to do that, act guiltily when they're perfectly innocent. Yes, that is true, said Poirot. But we must not lose sight of one thing. I know what you're going to say, I remarked. Motive. Ralph Patten inherits a great fortune by his uncle's death. That is one motive, agreed Poirot. One? Mais oui. Do you realize that there are 3 separate motives staring us in the face? Somebody certainly stole the blue envelope and its contents. That is one motive. Blackmail. Ralph Patten may have been the man who blackmailed Mrs. Ferrars. Remember, as far as Hammond knew, Ralph Patten had not applied to his uncle for help of late. That looks as though he were being supplied with money elsewhere. Then there is the fact that he was in some, scrape, which he feared might get to his uncle's ears. And finally, there is the one you have just mentioned. Dear me, I said, rather taken aback. The case does seem black against him. Does it? Said Poirot. That is where we disagree, you and I. 3 motives, it is almost too much. I am inclined to believe that, after all, Ralph Patten is innocent. Chapter 14. Mrs. Ackroyd. After the evening talk I have just chronicled, the affair seemed to me to enter on a different phase. The whole thing can be divided into 2 parts, each clear and distinct from the other. Part 1 ranges from Ackroyd's death on the Friday evening to the following Monday night. It is the straightforward narrative of what occurred, as presented to Hercule Poirot. I was at Poirot's elbow the whole time. I saw what he saw. I tried my best to read his mind. As I know now, I failed in this latter task. Though Poirot showed me all his discoveries, as for instance the gold wedding ring, he held back the vital and yet logical impressions that he formed. As I came to know later, this secrecy was characteristic of him. He would throw out hints and suggestions, but beyond that he would not go. As I say, up till the Monday evening, my narrative might have been that of Poirot himself. I played Watson to his Sherlock. But after Monday, Our ways diverged. Poirot was busy on his own account. I got to hear of what he was doing, because in King's Abbot, you get to hear of everything, but he did not take me into his confidence beforehand. And I, too, had my own preoccupations. On looking back, the thing that strikes me most is the piecemeal character of this period. Everyone had a hand in the elucidation of the mystery. It was rather like a jigsaw puzzle, to which everyone contributed their own little piece of knowledge or discovery. But their task ended there. To Poirot alone belongs the renown of fitting those pieces into their correct place. Some of the incidents seemed at the time irrelevant and unmeaning. There was, for instance, the question of the black boots. But that comes later. To take things strictly in chronological order, I must begin with the summons from Mrs. Ackroyd. She sent for me early on Tuesday morning, and since the summons sounded an urgent one, I hastened there, expecting to find her in extremis. The lady was in bed. So much did she concede to the etiquette of the situation. She gave me her bony hand, and indicated a chair drawn up to the bedside. "Well, Mrs. Ackroyd," I said, "and what's the matter with you?" I spoke with that kind of spurious geniality which seems to be expected of general practitioners. "I'm prostrated," said Mrs. Ackroyd in a faint voice. "Absolutely prostrated. It's the shock of poor Roger's death. They say these things often aren't felt at the time, you know. It's the reaction afterwards. It is a pity that a doctor is precluded by his profession from being able sometimes to say what he really thinks. I would have given anything to be able to answer Buncombe. Instead, I suggested a tonic. Mrs. Ackroyd accepted the tonic. One move in the game seemed now to be concluded. Not for a moment did I imagine that I had been sent for because of the shock occasioned by Ackroyd's death. But Mrs. Ackroyd is totally incapable of pursuing a straightforward course on any subject. She always approaches her object by tortuous means. I wondered very much why it was she had sent for me. "And then that scene yesterday," continued my patient. She paused as though expecting me to take up a cue. "What scene? Doctor, how can you? Have you forgotten? That dreadful little Frenchman, or Belgian, or whatever he is, bullying us all like he did. It has quite upset me. Coming on top of Roger's death." "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Ackroyd," I said. "I don't know what he meant, shouting at us like he did. I should hope I know my duty too well to dream of concealing anything. I have given the police every assistance in my power." Mrs. Ackroyd paused and I said, "Quite so." I was beginning to have a glimmering of what all the trouble was about. "No one can say that I have failed in my duty," continued Mrs. Ackroyd. "I am sure Inspector Raglan is perfectly satisfied. Why should this little upstart of a foreigner make a fuss? A most ridiculous-looking creature he is too, just like a comic Frenchman in a review. I can't think why Flora insisted on bringing him into the case. She never said a word to me about it. Just went off and did it on her own. Flora is too independent. I am a woman of the world and her mother. She should have come to me for advice first." I listened to all this in silence. What does he think? That's what I want to know. Does he actually imagine I'm hiding something? He positively accused me yesterday. I shrugged my shoulders. "It is surely of no consequence, Mrs. Ackroyd," I said. "Since you are not concealing anything, any remarks he may have made do not apply to you." Mrs. Ackroyd went off at a tangent, after her usual fashion. "Servants are so tiresome," she said. "They gossip and talk amongst themselves. And then it gets round, and all the time there's probably nothing in it at all." "Have the servants been talking?" I asked. "What about?" Mrs. Ackroyd cast a very shrewd glance at me. It quite threw me off my balance. "I was sure you'd know, Doctor, if anyone did. You were with M. Poirot all the time, weren't you?" "I was." "Then of course you know." It was that girl, Ursula Bourne, wasn't it? Naturally, she's leaving. She would want to make all the trouble she could. Spiteful, that's what they are. They're all alike. Now, you being there, doctor, you must know exactly what she did say. I'm most anxious that no wrong impression should get about. After all, you don't repeat every little detail to the police, do you? There are family matters sometimes, nothing to do with the question of the murder. But if the girl was spiteful, she may have made out all sorts of things. I was shrewd enough to see that a very real anxiety lay behind these outpourings. Poirot had been justified in his premises. Of the 6 people round the table yesterday, Mrs. Ackroyd at least had had something to hide. It was for me to discover what that something might be. If I were you, Mrs. Ackroyd, I said brusquely, I should make a clean breast of things. She gave a little scream. Oh, doctor, how can you be so abrupt? It sounds as though, and I can explain everything so simply. Then why not do so, I suggested. Mrs. Ackroyd took out a frilled handkerchief and became tearful. I thought, doctor, that you might put it to M. Poirot, explain it, you know, because it's so difficult for a foreigner to see our point of view. And you don't know, nobody could know what I've had to contend with. A martyrdom, a long martyrdom. That's what my life has been. I don't like to speak ill of the dead, but there it is. Not the smallest bill, but it had all to be gone over, just as though Roger had had a few miserly hundreds a year instead of being, as Mr. Hammond told me yesterday, one of the wealthiest men in these parts. Mrs. Ackroyd paused to dab her eyes with the frilled handkerchief. Yes, I said encouragingly. You were talking about bills? Those dreadful bills. And some I didn't like to show Roger at all. They were things a man wouldn't understand. He would have said the things weren't necessary. And of course they mounted up, you know, and they kept coming in. She looked at me appealingly, as though asking me to condole with her on this striking peculiarity. It's a habit they have, I agreed. And the tone altered, became quite abusive. I assure you, doctor, I was becoming a nervous wreck. I couldn't sleep at nights. And a dreadful fluttering round the heart. And then I got a letter from a Scotch gentleman. As a matter of fact, there were 2 letters, both Scotch gentlemen. Mr. Bruce Macpherson was one, and the other were Colin MacDonald. Quite a coincidence. Hardly that, I said dryly. They are usually Scotch gentlemen, but I suspect a Semitic strain in their ancestry. £10 to 10,000 on note of hand alone, murmured Mrs. Ackroyd reminiscently. I wrote to one of them, but it seemed there were difficulties. She paused. I gathered that we were just coming to delicate ground. I have never known anyone more difficult to bring to the point. You see, murmured Mrs. Ackroyd, it's all a question of expectations, isn't it? Testamentary expectations. And though, of course, I expected that Roger would provide for me, I didn't know. I thought that if only I could glance over a copy of his will, not in any sense of vulgar prying, but just so that I could make my own arrangements. She glanced sideways at me. The position was now very delicate indeed. Fortunately, words, ingeniously used, will serve to mask the ugliness of naked facts. I could only tell this to you, dear Dr. Shepherd, said Mrs. Ackroyd rapidly. I can trust you not to misjudge me, and to represent the matter in the right light to M. Poirot. It was on Friday afternoon. She came to a stop and swallowed uncertainly. Yes, I repeated encouragingly. On Friday afternoon. Well? Everyone was out, or so I thought. And I went into Roger's study. I had some real reason for going there, I mean there was nothing underhand about it. And as I saw all the papers heaped on the desk, it just came to me like a flash, I wonder if Roger keeps his will in one of the drawers of the desk. I'm so impulsive, always was from a child. I do things on the spur of the moment. He'd left his keys, very careless of him, in the lock of the top drawer. I see, I said helpfully. So you searched the desk. Did you find the will? Mrs. Ackroyd gave a little scream, and I realized that I had not been sufficiently diplomatic. How dreadful it sounds. But it wasn't at all like that, really. Of course it wasn't, I said hastily. You must forgive my unfortunate way of putting things. You see, men are so peculiar. In dear Roger's place, I should not have objected to revealing the provisions of my will. But men are so secretive. One is forced to adopt little subterfuges in self-defense. And the result of the little subterfuge? I asked. That's just what I'm telling you. As I got to the bottom drawer, Bourne came in. Most awkward. Of course I shut the drawer and stood up, and I called her attention to a few specks of dust on the surface. But I didn't like the way she looked, quite respectful in manner, but a very nasty light in her eyes. Almost contemptuous, if you know what I mean. I never have liked that girl very much. She's a good servant, and she says ma'am, and doesn't object to wearing caps and aprons, which I declare to you a lot of them do nowadays, and she can say not at home without scruples if she has to answer the door instead of Parker, and she doesn't have those peculiar gurgling noises inside which so many parlourmaids seem to have when they wait at table. Let me see, where was I? You were saying that in spite of several valuable qualities, you never liked Bourne. No more I do. She's odd. There's something different about her from the others. Too well educated, that's my opinion. You can't tell who are ladies and who aren't nowadays. And what happened next? I asked. Nothing. At least Roger came in. And I thought he was out for a walk. And he said, "What's all this?" And I said, "Nothing. I just came in to fetch Punch." And I took Punch and went out with it. Bourne stayed behind. I heard her asking Roger if she could speak to him for a minute. I went straight up to my room to lie down. I was very upset. There was a pause. You will explain to M. Poirot, won't you? You can see for yourself what a trivial matter the whole thing was. But of course, when he was so stern about concealing things, I thought of this at once. Bourne may have made some extraordinary story out of it, but you can explain, can't you? That is all? I said. You have told me everything? Yes, said Mrs. Ackroyd. Oh. Yes, she added firmly. But I had noted the momentary hesitation, and I knew that there was still something she was keeping back. It was nothing less than a flash of sheer genius that prompted me to ask the question I did. Mrs. Ackroyd, I said, was it you who left the silver table open? I had my answer in the blush of guilt that even rouge and powder could not conceal. How did you know? She whispered. It was you, then? Yes, you see, there were 1 or 2 pieces of old silver, very interesting. I had been reading up the subject, and there was an illustration of quite a small piece which had fetched an immense sum at Christie's. It looked to me just the same as the one in the silver table. I thought I would take it up to London with me when I went, and have it valued. Then if it really was a valuable piece, just think what a charming surprise it would have been for Roger. I refrained from comments, accepting Mrs. Ackroyd's story on its merits. I even forbore to ask her why it was necessary to abstract what she wanted in such a surreptitious manner. Why did you leave the lid open? I asked. Did you forget? I was startled, said Mrs. Ackroyd. I heard footsteps coming along the terrace outside. I hastened out of the room and just got up the stairs before Parker opened the front door to you. That must have been Miss Russell, I said thoughtfully. Mrs. Ackroyd had revealed to me one fact that was extremely interesting. Whether her designs upon Ackroyd's silver had been strictly honorable, I neither knew nor cared. What did interest me was the fact that Miss Russell must have entered the drawing room by the window, and that I had not been wrong when I judged her to be out of breath with running. Where had she been? I thought of the summer house and the scrap of cambric. I wonder if Miss Russell has her handkerchief starched, I exclaimed on the spur of the moment. Mrs. Ackroyd's start recalled me to myself, and I rose. You think you can explain to M. Poirot? She asked anxiously. Oh, certainly. Absolutely. I got away at last, after being forced to listen to more justifications of her conduct. The parlour-maid was in the hall, and it was she who helped me on with my overcoat. I observed her more closely than I had done heretofore. It was clear that she had been crying. "How is it," I asked, "that you told us that Mr. Ackroyd sent for you on Friday to his study? I hear now that it was you who asked to speak to him." For a minute the girl's eyes dropped before mine. Then she spoke. "I meant to leave in any case," she said uncertainly. I said no more. She opened the front door for me. Just as I was passing out, she said suddenly in a low voice, "Excuse me, sir, is there any news of Captain Patten?" I shook my head, looking at her inquiringly. "He ought to come back," she said. Indeed, he ought to come back." She was looking at me with appealing eyes. "Does no one know where he is?" she asked. "Do you?" I said sharply. She shook her head. "No, indeed. I know nothing. But anyone who was a friend to him would tell him this: he ought to come back." I lingered, thinking that perhaps the girl would say more. Her next question surprised me. "When do they think the murder was done?" "Just before 10 o'clock. "That is the idea," I said. "Between 9:45 and the hour." "Not earlier?" "Not before 9:45. I looked at her attentively. She was so clearly eager for a reply in the affirmative. "That's out of the question," I said. "Miss Ackroyd saw her uncle alive at 9:45. She turned away, and her whole figure seemed to droop. "A handsome girl," I said to myself as I drove off. "An exceedingly handsome girl." Caroline was at home. She had had a visit from Poirot, and was very pleased and important about it. "I am helping him with the case," she explained. I felt rather uneasy. Caroline is bad enough as it is. What will she be like with her detective instincts encouraged? "Are you going round the neighborhood looking for Ralph Patten's mysterious girl?" I inquired. "I might do that on my own account," said Caroline. "No, this is a special thing M. Poirot wants me to find out for him." "What is it?" I asked. "He wants to know whether Ralph Patten's boots were black or brown," said Caroline with tremendous solemnity. I stared at her. I see now that I was unbelievably stupid about these boots. I failed altogether to grasp the point. "They were brown shoes," I said. "I saw them." "Not shoes, James, boots. M. Poirot wants to know whether a pair of boots Ralph had with him at the hotel were brown or black. A lot hangs on it. Call me dense if you like. I didn't see." "And how are you going to find out?" I asked. Caroline said there would be no difficulty about that. Our Annie's dearest friend was Miss Gannett's maid Clara. And Clara was walking out with the boots at the Three Boars. The whole thing was simplicity itself, and by the aid of Miss Gannett, who cooperated loyally at once giving Clara leave of absence, the matter was rushed through at express speed. It was when we were sitting down to lunch that Caroline remarked, with would-be unconcern, "About those boots of Ralph Patten's." "Well," I said, "what about them?" M. Poirot thought they were probably brown. He was wrong. They're black. And Caroline nodded her head several times. She evidently felt that she had scored a point over Poirot. I did not answer. I was puzzling over what the color of a pair of Ralph Patten's boots had to do with the case. Chapter 15. Geoffrey Raymond. I was to have a further proof that day of the success of Poirot's tactics. That challenge of his had been a subtle touch, born of his knowledge of human nature. A mixture of fear and guilt had wrung the truth from Mrs. Ackroyd. She was the first to react. That afternoon when I returned from seeing my patients, Caroline told me that Geoffrey Raymond had just left. "Did he want to see me?" I asked as I hung up my coat in the hall. Caroline was hovering by my elbow. "It was M. Poirot he wanted to see," she said. "He'd just come from the Larches." M. Poirot was out. Mr. Raymond thought that he might be here, or that you might know where he was. I haven't the least idea. I tried to make him wait, said Caroline, but he said he would call back at the Larches in half an hour and went away down the village. A great pity, because M. Poirot came in practically the minute after he left. Came in here? No, to his own house. How do you know? The side window, said Caroline briefly. It seemed to me that we had now exhausted the topic. Caroline thought otherwise. Aren't you going across? Across where? To the Larches, of course. My dear Caroline, I said, what for? Mr. Raymond wanted to see him very particularly, said Caroline. You might hear what it's all about. I raised my eyebrows. Curiosity is not my besetting sin, I remarked coldly. I can exist comfortably, without knowing exactly what my neighbors are doing and thinking. Stuff and nonsense, James, said my sister. You want to know just as much as I do. You're not so honest, that's all. You always have to pretend. Really, Caroline, I said, and retired into my surgery. 10 minutes later, Caroline tapped at the door and entered. In her hand she held what seemed to be a pot of jam. I wonder, James, she said, if you would mind taking this pot of medlar jelly across to M. Poirot? I promised it to him. He has never tasted any homemade medlar jelly. Why can't Annie go? I asked coldly. She's doing some mending. I can't spare her. Caroline and I looked at each other. Very well, I said, rising. But if I take the beastly thing, I shall just leave it at the door. You understand that? My sister raised her eyebrows. Naturally, she said. Who suggested you should do anything else? The honors were with Caroline. If you do happen to see M. Poirot, she said as I opened the front door, you might tell him about the boots. It was a most subtle parting shot. I wanted dreadfully to understand the enigma of the boots. When the old lady with the Breton cap opened the door to me, I found myself asking if M. Poirot was in, quite automatically. Poirot sprang up to meet me, with every appearance of pleasure. Sit down, my good friend, he said. The big chair? This small one? The room is not too hot, no. I thought it was stifling, but refrained from saying so. The windows were closed and a large fire burned in the grate. The English people, they have a mania for the fresh air, declared Poirot. The big air, it is all very well outside where it belongs. Why admit it to the house? But let us not discuss such banalities. You have something for me, yes? 2 things, I said. First, this from my sister. I handed over the pot of medlar jelly. How kind of Mademoiselle Caroline. She has remembered her promise. And the second thing, information of a kind. And I told him of my interview with Mrs. Ackroyd. He listened with interest, but not much excitement. It clears the ground, he said thoughtfully. And it has a certain value, as confirming the evidence of the housekeeper. She said, you remember, that she found the silver table lid open and closed it down in passing. What about her statement, that she went into the drawing room to see if the flowers were fresh? Ah, we never took that very seriously, did we, my friend? It was patently an excuse, trumped up in a hurry, by a woman who felt it urgent to explain her presence, which, by the way, you would probably never have thought of questioning. I considered it possible that her agitation might arise from the fact that she had been tampering with the silver table, but I think now that we must look for another cause. Yes, I said. Whom did she go out to meet? And why? You think she went to meet someone? I do. Poirot nodded. So do I, he said thoughtfully. There was a pause. By the way, I said, I've got a message for you from my sister. Ralph Patton's boots were black, not brown. I was watching him closely as I gave the message, and I fancied that I saw a momentary flicker of discomposure. If so, it passed almost immediately. She is absolutely positive they are not brown? Absolutely. Ah, said Poirot regretfully. That is a pity. And he seemed quite crestfallen. He entered into no explanations, but at once started a new subject of conversation. The housekeeper, Miss Russell, who came to consult you on that Friday morning, is it indiscreet to ask what passed at the interview, apart from the medical details, I mean? Not at all, I said. When the professional part of the conversation was over, we talked for a few minutes about poisons, and the ease or difficulty of detecting them, and about drug taking and drug takers. With special reference to cocaine, asked Poirot. How did you know? I asked, somewhat surprised. For answer, the little man rose and crossed the room to where newspapers were filed. He brought me a copy of the Daily Budget, dated Friday the 16th of September, and showed me an article dealing with the smuggling of cocaine. It was a somewhat lurid article, written with an eye to picturesque effect. That is what put cocaine into her head, my friend, he said. I would have catechized him further, for I did not quite understand his meaning, but at that moment the door opened and Geoffrey Raymond was announced. He came in fresh and debonair as ever, and greeted us both. How are you, Doctor? M. Poirot, this is the second time I've been here this morning. I was anxious to catch you. Perhaps I'd better be off, I suggested rather awkwardly. Not on my account, Doctor. No, it's just this, he went on, seating himself at a wave of invitation from Poirot. I've got a confession to make. En vérité? Said Poirot with an air of polite interest. Oh, it's of no consequence, really. But as a matter of fact, my conscience has been pricking me ever since yesterday afternoon. You accused us all of keeping back something, M. Poirot. I pled guilty. I've had something up my sleeve. And what is that, M. Raymond? As I say, it's nothing of consequence, just this. I was in debt, badly, and that legacy came in the nick of time. £500 puts me on my feet again with a little to spare. He smiled at us both with that engaging frankness that made him such a likable youngster. You know how it is. Suspicious-looking policemen don't like to admit you were hard up for money, think it will look bad to them. But I was a fool, really, because Blunt and I were in the billiard room from 9:45 onwards, so I've got a watertight alibi, and nothing to fear. Still, when you thundered out that stuff about concealing things, I felt a nasty prick of conscience, and I thought I'd like to get it off my mind. He got up again and stood smiling at us. You are a very wise young man, said Poirot, nodding at him with approval. See you, when I know that anyone is hiding things from me, I suspect that the thing hidden may be something very bad indeed. You have done well. I'm glad I'm cleared from suspicion, laughed Raymond. I'll be off now. So that is that, I remarked as the door closed behind the young secretary. Yes, agreed Poirot. A mere bagatelle, but if he had not been in the billiard room, who knows? After all, many crimes have been committed for the sake of less than £500. It all depends on what sum is sufficient to break a man. A question of the relativity, is it not so? Have you reflected, my friend, that many people in that house stood to benefit by Mr. Ackroyd's death? Mrs. Ackroyd, Miss Flora, young Mr. Raymond, the housekeeper, Miss Russell. Only one, in fact, does not, Major Blunt. His tone in uttering that name was so peculiar that I looked up, puzzled. I don't quite understand you, I said. 2 of the people I accused have given me the truth. You think Major Blunt has something to conceal also? As for that, remarked Poirot nonchalantly, there is a saying, is there not, that Englishmen conceal only one thing, their love? And Major Blunt, I should say, is not good at concealments. Sometimes, I said, I wonder if we haven't rather jumped to conclusions on one point. What is that? We've assumed that the blackmailer of Mrs. Ferrars is necessarily the murderer of Mr. Ackroyd. Mightn't we be mistaken? Poirot nodded energetically. Very good. Very good indeed. I wondered if that idea would come to you. Of course it is possible. But we must remember one point. The letter disappeared. Still, that, as you say, may not necessarily mean that the murderer took it. When you first found the body, Parker may have abstracted the letter unnoticed by you. Parker? Yes, Parker. I always come back to Parker, not as the murderer. No, he did not commit the murder, but who is more suitable than he as the mysterious scoundrel who terrorized Mrs. Ferrars? He may have got his information about Mr. Ferrars's death from one of the King's paddock servants. At any rate, he is more likely to have come upon it than a casual guest such as Blunt, for instance. Parker might have taken the letter, I admitted. It wasn't till later that I noticed it was gone. How much later? After Blunt and Raymond were in the room, or before? I can't remember, I said slowly. I think it was before, no, afterwards. Yes, I'm almost sure it was afterwards. That widens the field to 3, said Poirot thoughtfully. But Parker is the most likely. It is in my mind to try a little experiment with Parker. How say you, my friend, will you accompany me to Fernley? I acquiesced, and we set out at once. Poirot asked to see Miss Ackroyd, and presently Flora came to us. Mademoiselle Flora, said Poirot, I have to confide in you a little secret. I am not yet satisfied of the innocence of Parker. I propose to make a little experiment with your assistance. I want to reconstruct some of his actions on that night. But we must think of something to tell him. Ah! I have it. I wish to satisfy myself as to whether voices in the little lobby could have been heard outside on the terrace. Now ring for Parker if you will be so good. I did so, and presently the butler appeared suave as ever. You rang, sir? Yes, my good Parker. I have in mind a little experiment. I have placed Major Blunt on the terrace outside the study window. I want to see if anyone there could have heard the voices of Miss Ackroyd and yourself in the lobby that night. I want to enact that little scene over again. Perhaps you would fetch the tray, or whatever it was you were carrying. Parker vanished, and we repaired to the lobby outside the study door. Presently, we heard a chink in the outer hall, and Parker appeared in the doorway carrying a tray with a siphon, a decanter of whiskey, and 2 glasses on it. One moment, cried Poirot, raising his hand and seemingly very excited. We must have everything in order, just as it occurred. It is a little method of mine. A foreign custom, sir, said Parker. Reconstruction of the crime they call it, do they not? He was quite imperturbable, as he stood there politely waiting on Poirot's orders. Ah, he knows something, the good Parker, cried Poirot. He has read of these things. Now I beg you, let us have everything of the most exact. You came from the outer hall, so? Mademoiselle was where? Here, said Flora, taking up her stand just outside the study door. Quite right, sir, said Parker. I had just closed the door, continued Flora. Yes, miss, agreed Parker. Your hand was still on the handle as it is now. Then allez, said Poirot. Play me the little comedy. Flora stood with her hand on the door handle, and Parker came stepping through the door from the hall bearing the tray. He stopped just inside the door. Flora spoke. Oh, Parker. Mr. Ackroyd doesn't want to be disturbed again tonight. Is that right? She added in an undertone. To the best of my recollection, Miss Flora, said Parker, but I fancy you used the word evening instead of night. Then, raising his voice in a somewhat theatrical fashion, very good, miss. Shall I lock up as usual? Yes, please. Parker retired through the door, Flora followed him, and started to ascend the main staircase. Is that enough? She asked over her shoulder. Admirable, declared the little man, rubbing his hands. By the way, Parker, are you sure there were 2 glasses on the tray that evening? Who was the second one for? I always bring 2 glasses, sir, said Parker. Is there anything further? Nothing. I thank you. Parker withdrew, dignified to the last. Poirot stood in the middle of the hall, frowning. Flora came down and joined us. Has your experiment been successful? She asked. I don't quite understand, you know. Poirot smiled admiringly at her. It is not necessary that you should, he said. But tell me, were there indeed 2 glasses on Parker's tray that night? Flora wrinkled her brows a minute. I really can't remember, she said. I think there were. Is that the object of your experiment? Poirot took her hand and patted it. Put it this way, he said. I am always interested to see if people will speak the truth. And did Parker speak the truth? I rather think he did, said Poirot thoughtfully. A few minutes later saw us retracing our steps to the village. What was the point of that question about the glasses? I asked curiously. Poirot shrugged his shoulders. One must say something, he remarked. That particular question did as well as any other. I stared at him. At any rate, my friend, he said more seriously, I know now something I wanted to know. Let us leave it at that.